Good evening and welcome to tonight's clinical seminar on temperature dysregulation, fear of harm's biological marker. We are glad to have you with us, and perhaps some of you were with us for our three-part seminar series in May and June of this year with Dr. Dimitri Popoulos, who is the research director at the Juvenile Bipolar Research Foundation. He took us through understanding this newly identified phenotype of bipolar disorder that has been dubbed fear of harm. And tonight, what we're going to do in a companion to that series is we are going to take a deep dive into the fear of harm symptom known as temperature dysregulation. And we're going to talk about the significance of that discovery in that it is a biological marker for the disorder. If you have not seen that clinical seminar series with Dr. Popoulos, I can recommend that you go to CMHRC's YouTube channel and you will find that series available in its own dedicated playlist. But for tonight, we are going to walk you through, as I said, the temperature dysregulation symptom and what it means to be a biological marker. But first, for those of you who are new to the Children's Mental Health Resource Center, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Errico, and I am the Executive Director of CMHRC. And it is our mission to provide guidance and resources for early identification and management of mood disorders and bipolar disorder in children, and for the early identification and management of fear of harm in children as well as in adults. My colleague, Jennifer Sevick, who is the clinical director at CMHRC, is going to be with us tonight. Please put any questions or comments that you may have while you're watching this event live into the Q&A. Jennifer will be able to triage those. She will be able to answer some. She will be able to hold some for the Q&A period at the end. And for anyone who is here for our live event, who is interested in getting information on how to receive a certificate of completion for providers or a certificate of attendance for families and other laymen, that information will be in a follow-up email from Zoom that you will get tomorrow, 24 hours after this seminar has ended. Those certificates are available for a small $5 preparation fee, and we will send them to you via email. Now, tonight, our learning objectives are going to start with understanding and making sure that we're all on the same page about what a biological marker or biomarker is. We're also going to understand what role they play in healthcare and why they're important in understanding mental health. We're also going to examine what temperature dysregulation is and how it is mitigated. And we will understand the influence of temperature dysregulation on symptom expression, on the fight or flight or freeze response, the stress response, and what are normal or expected sleep cycles and sleep functions. So, we don't talk about biological markers in mental health very often, in part because until extremely recently, there haven't really been any that have been identified. It's part of what makes it difficult for us as providers to be really confident about giving a diagnosis of certain mental illnesses that we consider to be serious, like bipolar, for example. Because there's no blood test or brain scan or throat swab that can be done to identify objectively and beyond the shadow of a doubt that an illness is present here, we tend, and especially in the case of children, to want to reserve judgment. It would be much easier if there was some sort of objective biological evidence of the presence of a particular mental illness, but up until now, that has, generally speaking, been impossible. But with the recent identification of this phenotype of bipolar disorder that's been dubbed fear of harm, or FOH for short, by its researchers, we actually finally have a biological marker for a mental health disorder. So we're going to start with looking at what exactly that biological marker is. The term biological marker is, in fact, a medical term that's used to describe some sort of biological phenomenon that can be objectively measured, and that its presence indicates the presence of or the severity of a specific disease. Biological markers can be measured in parts of the body like blood, bone, or tissue. For example, a blood test may show that there's a particular antibody present that would indicate that there is currently or has recently been a specific infection of some kind. Biomarkers are incredibly useful in the field of physical medicine. They can help determine the presence of a disease. They can help measure and monitor the progression of disease. They can evaluate the most effective ways to treat a disease, or to assess and predict a patient's risk for the disease development or progression. So biomarkers play really a crucial role in the fields of biology and medicine, helping with early diagnosis, disease prevention, and in the identification of medications which should be used during the treatment process. In short, a biological marker essentially can tell you whether or not an illness or disease exists in a specific person at a specific time. So when we tell you that the research team that first identified and has been studying FOH for the last 18 years or so also has identified a biological marker associated with it, trust us when we say this is a really big deal. Now, it definitely matters on a theoretical level because it represents a major paradigm shift in the field. But what really matters is that it changes how we go about diagnosing this illness dubbed fear of harm. How confident we can be that we're giving the correct diagnosis when we're diagnosing FOH. And most importantly, it changes how the illness gets treated. So in our seminars in May and June with Dr. Papalos, we talked about the fact that kids and teens are frequently misdiagnosed with disorders like ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And that's not the only thing that's happening, because fear of harm hasn't made its way into the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders yet. It's also happening in part because there are flaws in how the DSM is structured and used. We're actually going to have a seminar later this year that specifically talks about the DSM itself, how it's structured, how it's used, and how it actually contributes to confusion and misdiagnosis. But we're going to just touch on it a little bit today, so that we're all on the same page here. And so we can understand how having a biological marker really dramatically changes the game here. So if you're a mental health professional, you no doubt have a copy of the DSM on your desk or on your bookshelf right now. It may be the DSM-5 text revised. That's the most recent from 2022. It might be the DSM-5 the original text from 2014. You may have the 4TR from back in the early 2000s, but you've seen this book. Most everyone in the field, at least since 1980, has been taught with this book, trained with this book, and uses this book every single day. But the structure of the book has actually changed over the course of its existence, with the diagnostic criteria lists in clusters under different titles. And it's all based on how the third edition of the DSM was structured, which was a radical departure from the first two. The third edition was published in 1980, and it was really the result of a complete redesign and rethink. You see, the field had realized during the 1970s that we need to increase the likelihood that psychiatrists in different geographic areas would be able to see a patient with a certain set of symptoms and assign the same diagnosis as a provider in a different place at a different time with a different patient with symptoms that were presented. And the truth is that prior to DSM-3, that hadn't been happening consistently, which was something of an embarrassment to the professional community. So the American Psychiatric Association, which publishes the DSM, established a series of committees that would determine what the diagnoses ought to be, what the classifiable symptoms of each diagnosis would be, and the identifiable symptoms would be specific so that there could be high levels of reliability and consistency in the diagnostic process. This would mean that a patient reporting a set of symptoms to a physician in New York would be diagnosed with the same illness as a patient reporting the exact same symptoms to a physician in, say, California. Seemed like a significant improvement. There was one very important point to note, though. It's that the creators of the DSM very intentionally stated that the diagnostic process using the DSM would be neutral as to cause. Now let's think about what this means for a minute. This basically means that they were agreeing ahead of time that the committees that were tasked with determining diagnostic categories, diagnoses themselves, the symptoms of those diagnoses, would not look for, examine, or consider any cause of the disorders or those symptoms. None of that was included in the DSM. So what that means is that as practitioners, when we're using the DSM to help us diagnose, we don't have potential causes to look for, examine, or consider when we are assigning the diagnosis. People actually have a pretty hard time believing that this is true when we bring this up. So here's the direct quote from the American Psychiatric Association, that the DSM is an approach that attempted to be neutral with respect to causes of mental disorders. So the DSM committees established lists of observable behaviors that commonly occur with the given disorders. It's important to underscore when we are looking at the DSM committees and these established lists of observable behaviors that commonly occur with given disorders, that when we are focused on observable behaviors, there can't be any discussion about what the underlying cause of those set of symptoms are. And in the parlance of the field, what we are actually talking about when we're talking about observable behaviors are signs, not symptoms. And so when we focus on these signs and these observable behaviors, we are essentially disregarding the internal experience of the individual with the disorder. And this has led to a whole sort of slippery slope of language, which took us from the term symptom to the term behavior. Symptom is a medical term that is used in biological and medical contexts to describe the subjective experience of the patient. We have, however, moved in the fields of mental health, psychiatry, psychology to the term behavior, which unfortunately implies choice and intention. It's actually in the definition of the word behavior. And in many cases, the language we use to describe providers has changed from being psychologists to being behaviorists who are focused not on the psyche, but on behavior. So when we combine those observable behaviors, otherwise known as signs, in various ways to a strict provided formulaic process of diagnosing, we actually lose that subjective experience and we lose any ability to look for causes. When a patient tells their doctor about their symptoms, and when they're compared to the symptoms in the DSM, the doctor or clinician would, in theory, feel some sort of sense of confidence that anyone else who heard the same symptoms would give the same diagnosis. But let's keep in mind that this movement towards observable behaviors and signs wasn't done with the primary intention to benefit the patient. It was done with the primary intention to make the diagnostician feel more comfortable and more confident in their diagnosis. And it also meant that behavioral observation now rules the process of diagnosing, and everything we do is about those signs rather than being about their causes and therefore how to address them at their root. And of course, the truth is that without knowing the cause, there can't really be a way to treat it that actually stops the disorder. So just like with the common cold, where we're treating symptoms like a runny nose or a cough and nasal congestion because we can't treat the cause, this focus in mental health leads to problems in diagnosing that practitioners understand if they're really truly being honest with themselves. So what do you do when two different disorders have the same symptoms? Or what about when two different patients with the same disorder have different symptoms? Or what about when the symptoms of the diagnosis look different in kids versus how they look in adults? And honestly, what happens more often than not is we gravitate towards the more common diagnoses that we're familiar with as clinicians because we're more comfortable with them. But in doing so, we're actually running the risk that we're actually misdiagnosing. So you may be asking yourself at this point, what the heck does all of this have to do with biomarkers, Elizabeth? Well, the answer is that there are flaws in our system that derive from the fact that we are ignoring the causes of mental illness. But biomarkers can correct for that because they are biological symptoms. They are biological symptoms that we can trace with a cause. And so in the diagnosis that we refer to as FOH, the research team that first identified it back in 2006 was able to identify a biological marker associated with it. This is the first time that a mental health condition has ever had an associated biomarker, and it forces a paradigm shift because now that we have this biological marker, a physical symptom that can be objectively observed, subjectively experienced, and objectively measured, and which indicates the presence of the illness, and which can assist clinicians in the process of diagnosing by providing objective criteria that requires no subjective interpretation. It guides how treatment is delivered, providing objective and concrete benchmarks to assess the efficacy of the treatment modalities and by which to measure progress. Fear of harm has a biological marker. It is a disorder with a cause. We know what that biological cause is, It is one of the symptoms that is being experienced and a sign that can be objectively observed. And so we can treat that underlying cause instead of coming at it solely from the standpoint of treating behaviors. Additionally, it removes from us that dangerously slippery slope of assuming that all behaviors are under an individual's control, and therefore they're not making progress. If they're not making progress, that it must be the result of their own unwillingness to change or some sort of inability to correctly implement the treatment plan. Or in the case of children, that it's the parent's fault for not knowing how to parent effectively. So now we're going to talk about what is the biological marker associated with fear of harm. And that is the fact that the brain cannot properly control the body's temperature. We call this thermodysregulation or thermoregulatory dysfunction. And this thermoregulatory dysfunction is objective, it's observable, it is scientifically measurable, and it acts as a trigger, otherwise known as a cause, or to cascade the other symptoms of FOH, which are considered to be psychiatric or behavioral. So best of all, with this known biological marker, we now know that when it is treated, the other symptoms that it triggers go into remission as well. And we're going to get into that a little more detail in a moment. But for now, we need to note that the best part of having a biomarker is that it is not dependent upon a patient of any age, child, teenager, adult, or that patient's family reporting on a subjective experience of symptoms. The patient doesn't even actually have to be conscious of the temperature dysregulation because the biomarker is totally independent and can be tested for. In fear of harm, we can test for this temperature dysregulation biomarker, and when it appears, we can use it as a confirmation that the diagnosis of FOH is actually correct. This is possible because despite the fact that the rest of the symptom cluster contains behavioral or mood-based or subjective symptoms, which can overlap with other diagnoses, the presence of this unique biomarker in conjunction with those other mood and behavioral symptoms is required in order to make the diagnosis. So it ensures that this symptom cluster is not attributable to another disorder. So this biological marker gives us causes of the symptoms. It provides a path to treatment. This path to treatment addresses cause instead of, as I said before, just slapping a Band-Aid on the symptoms. So now we're going to take a look at what temperature dysregulation actually is. And Dr. Papalos referred to this during the seminar back in May and June of this year. But temperature dysregulation, in short, is about the brain's inability to maintain the body's temperature at or around the 98.6 degree Fahrenheit that we are accustomed to having as, quote, normal human body temperature. Temperature dysregulation also involves disruptions in the body's internal heat generation system, knowing when to generate that heat, knowing when to dissipate that heat, knowing when and how to trigger the cycles and rhythms of heat generation and dissipation in the body that naturally occur throughout the day for everyone. And it also refers to the body's ability to manage temperature differentials between indoor and outdoor temperatures and temperatures in the environment from one day to the next. When all of these functions are happening correctly, the way they're supposed to, the body has good, stable temperature regulation. But when there is a dysfunction in the brain that causes these disruptions in the temperature regulation systems of the body, when the brain cannot correctly regulate and control body temperature, that's what we call thermodysregulation or temperature dysregulation or thermoregulatory dysregulation. It's all the same term. So the way this is measured scientifically and objectively is not by taking a temperature the way you would to detect if a person had a fever. The way that this temperature dysregulation is detected is through a disruption in the normal ratio between what are called proximal and distal body temperatures. Proximal meaning the body's core temperatures, and distal meaning the body's peripheral temperatures on the extremities. And so these two temperatures are never going to be the same in anyone. And this should make intuitive sense. Our body's core, our heart, our sternum, the internal part of our body is going to have a different temperatures than, say, the tips of our fingers or our toes. But there is a ratio between those two temperatures that is scientifically and biologically considered to be normal. And so when the body temperature differential between proximal and distal temperatures is outside the band of what's expected, it tells us that the body is not actually releasing heat properly from the core because it needs to dissipate that heat out through the body's shell. And so if that shell temperature is too low and the core temperature is too high and the differential between them is too great, then what we're seeing is that the body isn't releasing the heat that it is generating properly. This inability to dissipate heat and to correctly regulate body temperature triggers a whole series of other symptoms in this disorder, which are described in behavioral terms. Now, most people are not going to follow the procedures for collecting temperature data in the scientific way to demonstrate the disrupted ratio between proximal and distal body temperatures. It's complicated. It takes weeks to compile the appropriate data and interpret it. But honestly, that is no reason to be deterred from exploring this, because in most cases, in practice, in real life, temperature dysregulation is very easy to spot once you know what to look for. The biggest obstacle that most people experience in identifying temperature dysregulation is the fact that they haven't been taught to look for it. And they haven't been taught to associate it with a mental illness. So for diagnosing thermoregulatory problems in kids or adults for that matter, we can simply look for the presence of two of the following indicators. So at least two of the following indicators: that they feel excessively warm or hot at bedtime or overheat during the night, that they feel cold in the morning after having felt hot at bedtime, they feel excessively warm during the day in neutral temperatures, they show moderate to extreme cold tolerance, and that they overheat or sweat profusely with minimal exertion. So temperature dysregulation is most often described in shorthand as overheating, which can occur during the day, during the night, while sleeping, really at any time. And the physical signs of overheating include sweating a lot during exercise. Individuals will say that other people might be perspiring a little bit, but they're a big sweaty mess. They're sweating when it's not particularly hot out. Other people are comfortable in the ambient temperatures, but they're finding them to be hot and intolerable. Having red, flushed face or ears, having warmer than usual skin, and as I said, the telltale sign of thermodysregulation, which is that the ears, which Dr. Papalos calls the thermostat of the brain, are bright red and actually hot to the touch. Parents often describe that their child's torso feels like a radiator with heat emanating from it. So, in addition to these signs of overheating during the day, you may also notice or have described to you that the person has a moderate to extreme cold tolerance, which means that they're comfortable in cold outdoor temperatures even without weather appropriate clothes. In fact, most parents report that this results in arguments because their kids won't agree to wear coats or jackets or sweaters, sweatshirts, or even long sleeve shirts or pants, um, even when it is freezing out. Um, Kids and adults with thermoregulatory issues will often want to wear summer clothes all year long. And many parents report that it is literally a knockdown, drag out fight to try to get their kids to put on a coat before going out in freezing temperatures in the wintertime. But when we understand what temperature dysregulation is and we understand the motivation, wearing a coat makes the body hotter. It traps air against their skin, which then their overheating body heats the air, making them even more hot. And it creates this cycle where they cannot cool down and they simply do not acclimate to wearing the coat the way that those who can thermoregulate do. And so this dysfunction leads to those other symptoms that we talked about. And sometimes the person may even refuse to wear clothes at all most of the time. Kids often strip off their clothes as soon as they get in the car after school or as soon as they get home. They spend days around the house in nothing but their underwear. They won't put on shoes and socks or slippers. And when they're going out, they may delay until the very last possible second getting dressed before they have to leave the house. Authority figures will often see this as behaving in a difficult manner, being defiant or oppositional, because they're not complying with the task that's being asked of them. But they're doing it somewhat unconsciously because, as I said, they're avoiding getting that air trapped against their skin. And they don't want to add those layers of clothing that they know consciously or unconsciously is going to make them physically uncomfortable, is going to feel intolerable, and is going to wind up triggering them to experience symptoms of FOH that others are going to interpret as behavioral choices. So when we look at it through this lens, it's easy to realize that not putting on a coat isn't actually an oppositional behavior at all. Another aspect of cold tolerance is difficulty actually telling what the temperature is in the environment around them, either indoors or outdoors. These folks who have this extreme or moderate cold tolerance also simply don't register the cold on their skin. Researchers at Harvard Medical School's McLean Hospital conducted a study in conjunction with the Juvenile Bipolar Research Foundation back in 2020 and 2021, in which they found that when they exposed the skin of people with this temperature dysregulation component of FOH, when they exposed their skin to heat or cold, warming or cooling, the individual was unable to identify the temperature shift that they were experiencing. This temperature disruption has another set of negative consequences because even though they don't register the cold or heat consciously, when they're outside, the body does recognize that it's cold and starts to generate heat again in order to warm itself up. Now, once the body turns on that heat generating furnace, it likely won't, because of this temperature disruption, recognize when it is time to turn that furnace back off again, which means that the furnace is running all of the time, always generating heat. The Person is continually getting warmer and warmer throughout the day. The body is not releasing that built up heat. And so it becomes intolerable by the late afternoon or early evening. And this leads to issues of overheating that last into the nighttime. Now, in the nighttime, it starts with feeling excessively warm or hot at bedtime, overheating during sleep, and culminates with feeling cold in the early morning. This is in direct opposition to the body's natural temperature rhythms, which have the body cooling down in the evening, staying stable throughout the sleep cycles, and then feeling warm in the morning as the body attempts to wake up. So in this disrupted pattern of sleep, what we find is that at bedtime, a person may feel so hot, they become restless, they cannot get into bed, they cannot get comfortable, they can't settle down, and or they won't put on their pajamas. Kids, in both of these cases, parents and caregivers are inclined to see this behavior as oppositional, uncooperative. They're not following instructions. They're not doing as they're asked, when in fact, it is an involuntary reaction to built up heat that is trapped in their bodies. Now, during the night when they are supposed to be asleep, that overheating usually results in restless sleep. They won't use sheets and blankets. They kick them off while they are sleeping. They sweat while they're sleeping, with or without sheets and blankets. And sometimes it's so significant that the sheets are damp or wet when the person awakes. In the early morning, as I mentioned, feeling cold in the morning is part of that faulty temperature regulation system, because we're supposed to warm up in the morning in order to prepare the body for waking and becoming alert. And so you can tell that a person has this temperature dysregulation problem in part because in the morning they have a significant difficulty waking up, and they want to stay bundled up in their blankets. Oftentimes, children will say to their parents who are trying to wake them up for school that they can't get up, that their legs don't work, that their eyes won't open. And again, parents and caregivers see this as a choice. The kid just doesn't want to get up for school. And sure, we can relate to that. Who wants to get up early in the morning? But it has to be done. So if they're not doing it, they must be doing it on purpose to be difficult. When in truth, the temperature dysregulation is causing their brain to say, it's still sleep time, stay asleep. And as I say all the time, when a parent is trying to get a child out of bed and the child's brain is telling them it's time for them to be asleep, the brain is going to win out every time. So once you become aware of what to look for, it becomes easier to intervene and to help manage this thermodysregulation. In fact, we just last week had a webinar available to the general public called Cooling Strategies and Cooling Plans, where we discuss in depth how to use specific temperature regulation strategies, related items, how to develop a schedule for waking hours for school, and how to develop a cooling plan and circadian rhythm resets for nighttime and sleeping. And we make it easy to integrate these into daily life to alleviate the temperature dysregulation and in turn alleviate the symptoms that it triggers. If you weren't able to see that one with us last week, it is available to our members starting the 1st of next month. And then later at the end of next month, it will be made available on our YouTube page for anyone to view. Again, it's called Cooling Strategies and Cooling Plans. And as a companion to that, we have a book that is available through Amazon. You can purchase it on Amazon through a link on our website, and it is called Managing Temperature and Sleep Disruptions in FOH and Other Mental Health Disorders. It goes through all of the cooling strategies that you can use. It has blank templates so you can create cooling plans and sleep regulation plans for yourself, and it even has templates that can be used to supply the necessary information to schools so that you can have a template for how to use these strategies during the school day. So if you're interested, please check out our YouTube channel and the shop on cmhrc.org/shop in order to get that book on creating your own cooling plans. But for now, I'm going to go over a very brief overview of these strategies. And the first one is that you will need to stay in a steady temperature environment throughout the day. Extreme temperature fluctuations in the environment confuses the body's already dysregulated temperature system. And so by avoiding extremes and changes, it will reduce the stress that's put on the thermoregulatory system. Next, the person really should not be wearing clothing that they do not absolutely have to wear. You can prevent overheating if the child or adult is able to remove unnecessary clothing that will then prevent them from overheating. For kids, if they're willing to wear a sweatshirt but not a coat, that's okay. That will increase the likelihood that that built up heat will be dissipated. The next way to manage thermodysregulation is to help the body get rid of the excess heat that's trapped inside of it. And this is something that's tricky to understand because a lot of people initially interpret this to mean make the person cold instead of hot. But that's not really what you want to do because what you're doing in that case is you are actually just triggering the body's temperature control to kick in again. That furnace turns on. You're generating new heat to compensate for how cold the person is. But that is not what you want to do because that furnace isn't going to be able to turn itself off again later. And that just causes the cycle of overheating to continue. So the idea here is to make it easier for heat to escape the body. These strategies should be done proactively throughout the day, whether or not you can observe overheating. We call that preventative cooling. And although sometimes there is heat buildup, that you're going to need to correct. And so we use these same strategies targeted at specific times to address as a tool of corrective cooling. These are all laid out in the templates in the book that I just mentioned. Now, the best way to correct overheating or to prevent it is to submerge the body, specifically the torso and the head, in a bath or in a swimming pool to pull that excess heat out of the body's core. Water temperatures that are typical of an indoor swimming pool, anywhere from 78 to 82 or 86 degrees is sort of the perfect temperature for this strategy. You can also promote heat dissipation, as we mentioned before, in reducing clothing and blankets that trap air next to the skin. You can also opt for breathable fabrics or mesh that allow heat to escape much more quickly. You'll want to keep the palms of the hands, the bottoms of the feet, the scalp, and the tips of the ears clear from those coverings so that it can dissipate heat, the body can dissipate that heat more easily. You also want to add fans to the environment in order to blow air across the skin, which literally whisks the heat out of the exposed pores. Keeping cooling cloths available can provide soothing coolness on the skin, which prompts the brain to actually send the blood there to that spot, therefore allowing it to pull heat away from the core and release it out through the skin. One of the absolute easiest and best ways for your health to engage in some cooling strategies is actually to drink ice water regularly. It cools the body from the inside out. Now, one of the important things, as I said before, is to remember that with temperature dysregulation, it doesn't just make people hot. This disruption, including overheating, also triggers symptoms that appear to be behavioral and psychiatric. But just as overheating can trigger these so-called behavioral symptoms in the case of fear of harm. Reducing and stabilizing body temperature can assist in getting rid of some of those symptoms that are described as behavioral or seen as psychiatric. So we're going to look at what those behavioral symptoms are that are triggered by temperature dysregulation. And the first is the activation of the fight, flight, freeze response. The brain, the part of the brain that controls the triggering of the fight, flight, freeze response is actually related to the part of the brain that controls temperature regulation. And so we actually had last year, and we're going to do them again this year in an encore, a two-part series on the limbic system and how the limbic system contributes to behavior dysregulation, and therefore how it can be used to help re-regulate and de-escalate symptom outbursts. We go into tremendous detail on the fight, flight, freeze response here as a behavioral sign of illness. But you can look for that on our YouTube page as well. But right now, I'm not going to go into that level of scientific detail. Right now, I'm just going to review it briefly so that we're all on the same page. So we all know that the brain's fight, flight, freeze response is a built-in response to danger. It is designed to keep us safe. When we encounter, our autonomic nervous system takes over and it starts to make changes in the systems of the body that are going to help us react appropriately to that danger. So for example, in a fight, flight, freeze response, our pupils dilate to help us see better by taking in more light. We start breathing harder and increase respiration in order to pump blood more quickly from the heart to the muscles so we can jump, swing, run, or fight faster and farther and longer. These aren't symptoms that our body can usually consciously control, but our brains take over to prepare us and to protect ourselves by either fighting, fleeing, or freezing. But when there is a dysregulated body temperature system, the overheating triggers this fight, flight, freeze instinct to respond when there isn't any danger and it isn't necessary. So I do want to pause here for just a moment to be totally clear that this is not a social and emotional rejection of a subjective experience. We are not suggesting that a child has fears that should be dismissed, that we should be manipulating them. We are not hiding abuse or trauma. What we are doing here is talking very specifically about what happens when the body temperature regulation system accidentally triggers the fight, flight, freeze response. It is triggered by a biological process, not by a social or emotional trigger. Now, a classic example of the fight, flight, freeze response becoming triggered by temperature dysregulation, one that has been reported countless times by teachers and parents, is asking a child to put on their shoes. For a child who has fear of harm, being asked to put your shoes on can be quite challenging. So we imagine a scenario in which a family's getting ready in the morning to leave for work and go to school, and the kids have to catch the bus, and the dog needs to have its food put out, and breakfast has to be finished, and teeth brushed, and bags packed, and lunches collected, and all the rest. And a parent says to their child, "Put on your shoes now, we have to leave." And then a few minutes later, the parent realizes that the child hasn't put their shoes on. And so they ask again, a little more sternly, and they say, "Put on your shoes now, we have to leave." This in and of itself, the stern tone of voice, an exasperated tone of voice, all of the rest, it can result in that triggering of the fight, flight, freeze response when the body is overheated. And that instruction of "put on your shoes now" is actually interpreted as a serious and dangerous threat. The response to this instruction could be a fight. There could be oppositional behaviors, throwing things, hitting, screaming, cursing, that erupt. For those interested in getting a firsthand look at what this is what this looks like, I recommend reading a post from an author named Liza Long. She wrote a piece in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting where she was talking about Adam Lanza's behavior, and she was talking about her fears for her own child who was suffering from a mental illness. The second response in the fight, flight, freeze response here, to put on your shoes now, is the flight response, which would involve running away, taking defensive positions. The child might be hiding, crying, or disengaging physically, fleeing, running away. The third is the freeze response, and this can look like no response at all. It looks as though the child is ignoring the instruction or the person altogether. They're standing still, they're unable to comply. Maybe it looks like they're just going about their business as usual and are not paying any attention to the adult who's speaking to them. This is, again, the result of this biological process of overheating. So on the outside, these behaviors appear to be irrational, confusing, frustrating, like there's some sort of intentional resistance, and they are characterized as the child is misbehaving. But on the inside, it is an entirely rational, survival-based threat response to the stress that the child is experiencing as a result of their body's temperature dysregulation. This same scenario plays out over and over and over again in different situations with different requests in different settings, from showering to doing homework to transitioning classes to coming in from recess to saying goodbye at a friend's birthday party or grandma's house. On the outside, caregivers and adults see resistance, what they call misbehaving, or oppositional behaviors in teens. On the inside, though, the experience is one of incredible stress. And since untreated temperature dysregulation is always present, it becomes very difficult to escape that near constant state of stress, which in turn impacts behavior. Now, the stages of stress include alarm resistance and exhaustion. When kids who are living with mental illnesses like mood disorders, bipolar disorder, and FOH, they're experiencing this stress response every single day. They're trying to cope with internally extreme circumstances. So when something, really anything, happens in their environment, their immediate response is to feel threatened. That is especially true in the case of FOH and its symptom of misinterpreting environmental threats. So what happens? Well, again, the alarm stage, fight, flight, freeze happens. The next stage is resistance. And in the resistance stage, the initial intensity of the fight, flight, freeze response has passed, it's over, but the brain is still telling the body to remain hypervigilant. They're looking out for what else is coming, what might be coming next on the heels of that first danger. The threat, even if it has been misperceived, if multiple ones occur in rapid succession, have overlapping refractory periods, then the body stays in that state of hypervigilance continuously, which causes the brain and the body to continue to produce stress hormones that keep the cycle going. Signs of a prolonged or ongoing resistance stage are things such as irritability, low frustration tolerance, and low levels of concentration. The final stage of the stress response is exhaustion. And in this stage, the avalanche of ongoing stress drains the person's mental, physical, and emotional resources. And at this point, stress tolerance drops even further, and they experience the inability to cope with even the smallest of setbacks. And levels of anxiety, fatigue, and depression all rise. Anyone who has spent time around a child or a teen with a mental illness will recognize all of these resistance and exhaustion stage effects as symptoms. or signs which manifest that the authority figure and professionals in the environment interpret as, quote, difficult behaviors. This implies choice and intention, which is clearly inaccurate and easy to recognize as such when we take into account the reality of the temperature dysregulation and its impact on the stress response cycle. Kids, generally speaking, have little to no control over their lives and their schedule. So imagine being a kid with a mental illness who is dealing with constant alarm, aka fight, flight, freeze, resistance, and exhaustion. What happens when that child can't stay on task in school? Most often, they are labeled as work avoidant. They're denied recess. They're given detention. But once we understand this stress cycle and how it is impacted by biological processes that go along with temperature dysregulation, which the child has absolutely zero control over, we can see how cruel these kinds of punishments actually are. Temperature dysregulation also significantly impacts the body's ability to regulate healthy sleep patterns. And people with bipolar and fear of harm experience a whole host of sleep disturbances, including trouble falling asleep, trouble waking up in the morning, trouble staying asleep and experiencing extreme restlessness during the night. And they have sleep inertia. They also have disruptions in the transitions from REM sleep to non-REM sleep, which are called parasomnias. And these include nightmares and night terrors, sleepwalking and sleep talking, bedwetting and teeth grinding, and even hallucinations that occur on the cusp of sleep. So imagine being a small child and becoming conscious during REM sleep, when your body is paralyzed and you're experiencing a very vivid, horrific nightmare. Nightmares that are the staples of FOH and common in bipolar disorder. These sleep paralysis nightmare combinations are quite simply traumatic, and the repetitive nature of these nightmares is an ongoing trauma that contributes to the continual cycle of going through these stages of stress, alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. It's honestly very hard for many people, professionals included, to imagine that problems with body temperature regulation could possibly produce all of these sleep disruptions and in turn cause what we think of as behavioral problems. But decades of research by sleep experts has shown that changes in brain waves as a result of temperature changes are happening and that produce these significant symptoms. Researchers, again, at the Juvenile Bipolar Research Foundation conducted a study on this phenomenon at the Cornell University Sleep Center. And in this study, they looked at sleep-wake records that were measuring the body's proximal and distal temperatures. And in individuals who have a normally functioning temperature regulatory system, so their proximal and distal body temperature ratios are correct, you'll see that the red line for distal body temperature and the blue line for proximal body temperature crisscross. They cross at sleep onset, which was represented at the beginning of the graph around 2300 hours or 11 p.m. They cross back and forth a little bit during the sleep cycle, and then they cross again in the morning during at waking point, which is about 7:30 on this chart. In this second graph, though, which shows the temperature cycles in patients who have fear of harm, proximal and distal body temperatures don't crisscross one another. The red and blue lines never intersect. They never cross one another. This data is showing this misalignment between proximal and distal body temperature disrupting sleep. It just shows that it's disrupting the ability to fall asleep by not crisscrossing at sleep onset. It is demonstrating a difficulty with waking up by not crisscrossing at waking time. And it is showing a difficulty in staying asleep and sleeping properly during the night, because in the normal nocturnal proximal to distal body temperature graph, you see that for the most part, distal body temperature, the red line stays above the blue with a couple of exceptions. Whereas in the FOH patient, the blue line stays above the red line all night long. Fundamentally, what we are seeing here is that body temperature dysregulation is the biological marker and the reason why children and adults with temperature disruptions as a result of fear of harm have such significant sleep disruptions in getting to sleep, in staying asleep, and in waking up correctly in the morning. So this is a biological phenomenon. It can be measured. It indicates the presence of the disorder and the severity of the disorder and the disorder's other symptoms. It is a key identifying feature in treating the FOH phenotype of bipolar disorder. The disorder's name is continuing to evolve. As I said, we do continue to call it FOH, but something temperature related has almost always been included in the name. As the research has developed, the researchers have evolved the name to reflect their knowledge, and it started out as fear of harm in relation to this hallmark symptom of hypervigilance, increased and extreme fears, and misperceptions of environmental threats. But in response to new data, it has evolved. It was called thermoregulatory fear of harm mood disorder. It's been called bipolar fear of harm disorder. It's been called thermoregulatory threat survival disorder, bipolar disorder with thermoregulatory dysfunction, and it is currently referred to in the researchers' literature as thermoregulatory sleep dysregulation disorder. It is almost always included thermoregulatory in the name, and it continues to be referred to as FOH as short of hand. Now, hopefully by now you will agree that the biomarker of thermodysregulation is really crucial to being able to understand and treat bipolar disorder and bipolar FOH. By understanding the effects of thermodysregulation and the effects it has on not just the temperature regulation system, but on sleep and on those so-called behavioral symptoms, we can understand that individuals living with this condition deserve to be received with compassion, with empathy, and with an understanding that they're not being willful or intentional or defiant or oppositional or manipulative or any of the other characterological terms that could be applied. They are responding in a biologically expected way to a biological phenomenon. And with this known biomarker, we can treat the cause of those disruptions by treating the temperature dysregulation in a targeted way that then has a cascading effect on all the other symptoms of FOH. As I mentioned earlier, we do have this resource book that contains detailed information about the impact of temperature and sleep, disruptions on mood, and on symptoms. This goes through in significantly more detail than we did today on how to use cooling strategies and other interventions to create a cooling plan for yourself, a sleep plan, and a school plan for you or a loved one. Or your clients if you're a practitioner. There are checklists and templates that can be used to design these personal plans, and they will fundamentally, if you follow the guidelines in this book, will help you develop plans where you can cool down, sleep better, and really optimize treatment most effectively so that the individual with this temperature dysregulation problem can experience stability. This is a great book for families. It's a great book for educators to understand and develop plans for school. And it's a great tool for providers to use to help their clients make the kinds of changes proactively in their day that are necessary. You can find this book on our website, www.cmhrc.org/shop. We have other books in there, in-depth examinations of FOH, how to identify it, how to diagnose it. Same in-depth book on bipolar disorder and others that are in that shop. So if you're interested in getting these as a resource in your practice or as a resource for your family, they are readily available. Amazon will print it and ship it to you as quickly as they can. Now, these next couple of slides have information on the research papers and published peer-reviewed articles that were used in the preparation of this presentation. Again, if you would like a certificate of completion and you were attending our live event, look for that attendance email tomorrow from Zoom. There will be links in there as to how to request your certificate of completion for providers or certificate of attendance for laymen for a small $5 processing and preparation fee. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the screen share and I'm going to address some of the questions that were brought up in the Q&A. And so in the Q&A, what we see is a couple of questions. The first is, what age do FOH temperature dysregulation symptoms usually show up in children? That's a great question. It is variable. Some parents can trace these temperature dysregulations once they've been able to identify them back to early infancy. Parents will talk about not being able to keep their child swaddled because they would sweat through their swaddling blankets. Parents talk about toddlers who strip off their pajamas during the night. One mother in our community even talked about how she used to pin her daughter's zipper on her footy jammies shut so that her daughter couldn't get them open because she would routinely in the dead of winter pull off her pajamas. For some folks, they don't notice it until later on. There are slightly more complicated versions of this temperature dysregulation system that can sometimes make people feel cold all of the time. More research needs to be done into that. And Dr. Pavlos did answer a question about that during our Q&A last June on the topic. We also have a question here about how is overheating different from autonomic dysfunction that includes feeling cold and feeling hot, not just overheating? What if a patient has temperature dysfunction, both hot and cold, and shows behavioral symptoms of FOH, but they're not only overheating? Yes, again, excellent question. There are some cases where what is reported in terms of temperature dysregulation is feeling cold all of the time instead of feeling hot. Sometimes that's because they feel cold even though they are actually hot, and it's a result of their body not being able to tell the difference. We also have folks in our community whose children will find that one part of their body is overheating and hot while another part of their body is freezing cold. We've had parents describe their child with their ice cold feet inside of a warm foot bath to warm their feet up while they've got a cooling gel neck ring around their neck with a fan pointed at their face because their face and ears and neck and chest are so hot. So this temperature dysregulation can manifest differently. As I said, there needs to be more research done into it in order to tease out what's happening. But the truth of the matter is that temperature dysregulation is temperature dysregulation. And so once parents know what to look for, they usually are able to detect it pretty quickly. The next question here is, can a child fail a bipolar survey screening and still have FOH with temperature dysregulation? I think what's really being asked there, and feel free to jump into the Q&A and add an additional comment if I'm wrong, but what I think is being asked here is, can the FOH and temperature dysregulation exist separately from bipolar disorder? So assuming that is what was meant by this question, I will share the same answer that Dr. Papalos, the lead researcher who first identified this disorder and has been studying it for the last 20 years, what he says is that he hasn't seen it yet. Temperature dysregulation exists independently of this diagnosis. But what makes it so clear in the diagnostic process is that unlike other diagnoses that appear in the DSM, where you have to have 5 of 7 of the diagnostic criteria to receive the diagnosis, or you need 7 out of 10, or you need 3 out of 5, or in one that I dislike very much, in conduct disorder, a child needs 1 of all of the symptoms listed in order to be diagnosed with it. In all of those cases, there's so much possibility for misunderstanding those symptoms as being part of a different disorder. What makes FOH unique, not only in terms of having a biomarker of temperature dysregulation, is that all of the symptoms have to be present. All of the diagnostic criteria have to be present in order to get it. Otherwise, you just have a temperature dysregulation that maybe is caused by dysautonomia or some other autonomic issue. And so when we look at the fear of harm criteria, the first one is a diagnosis of some form of bipolar disorder. That is criteria A. Diagnosis of some form of bipolar disorder, or the existence of erratic, unpredictable mood swings that are involuntary. That is in its way a definition of bipolar disorder, one version of it. And so criteria A, you have to have that bipolar mood fluctuation that's happening, that mood instability. Next, you have to have the hypervigilance, the chronic hypervigilance, the chronic activation of the fight, flight, freeze response when it is not necessary, misperceptions of threat, and a defensive and reactive aggression. Dr. Papalos is clear that this is not proactive aggression. These people with this disorder are not picking fights. They are responding in a defensively aggressive way to what they perceive as threats. Then there are sleep disruptions that we talked about, inability to fall asleep, inability to stay asleep, inability to get up effectively in the morning, these parasomnias, the nightmares, the bedwetting, the teeth grinding, having some kind of temperature initiated sleep disruption. And then they also need to be able to demonstrate that this isn't the result of some other physical or psychiatric illness. You have to have all of those diagnostic criteria met, in addition to the temperature dysregulation. So that's what we mean when we say the presence of this biomarker can prove or disprove the presence of FOH. Because if you have all of those symptoms, but you do not have the temperature dysregulation, then you have what may be a more traditional bipolar disorder diagnosis or another mental health disorder. But once you have those symptoms, plus you have the temperature dysregulation, then we know the diagnosis of fear of harm is likely correct. So it's a very important tool. Hopefully that answers the question. So this person did follow up and say that recently, based on a survey that they took, the child did not appear to have bipolar disorder, but so much of FOH meets our symptoms. I'm going to say to you the author of that comment, reach out to ADMIN, that's admin, ADMIN at cmhrc.org, and go to our website, cmhrc.org, and look at our diagnostic consultation service. If you are just filling out surveys online, you are not getting a true diagnostic consultation, because it takes a trained clinician to be able to differentiate what symptoms belong to what disorder. And so what we do is we take a very holistic approach. We look at those surveys, we look at those assessments, but we also do clinical interviews. We also do additional assessments that specifically look at things like temperature regulation, history, pediatric records, school experiences. As I said, a very holistic approach, and trying to help you and your provider figure out whether or not the diagnosis of bipolar or FOH or something else is accurate. We don't go into it looking for bipolar FOH. We go into it looking for the opportunity to do a full differential diagnosis, looking at all of the disorders that these symptoms present in, and one by one ruling them out until we have the last one standing that is most likely correct. We do these consultations with families. We also do them with providers if you need additional help with cases that seem like they're very complex and you're not sure how to sort through them and figure out the causes and the treatments necessary. Again, check out our website, cmhrc.org, or reach out to admin at cmhrc.org for additional information with getting connected to someone to get information on that process. So the next question we have here is, how does someone test for this biomarker? So as I said during the presentation, and I'll add one more thing. If you think your child might have FOH, if you think you have a patient who may have FOH, if you think there's a student in your class who may have FOH, go to our shop, get that book on FOH. It has checklists. It has criteria explanations. It has interventions for treatment. It's a one-stop shop to help you understand the diagnosis, how to identify it, and how to treat it. We have practitioners who have their clients get it, fill it out at home, bring it in, turn it over to the provider, and then you have the information laid out in front of you so that you can make a confident diagnosis. So again, back to how does one test for the biomarker? There is no singular test. As I said, there's no blood test, there's no brain scan, there's no throat swab that is going to tell you whether or not a person has the thermodysregulation. The way thermodysregulation is measured scientifically in the context of research studies involves using a specialized thermometer that taking temperature on 3 different parts of the body at 3 different times of day, the same time every day, for a series of weeks or months, and then graphing those and looking at the differentials between the proximal and distal body temperatures, tracking sleep, looking at body temperature in relation to sleep onset and sleep awakening in the morning. And as I said earlier, it's scientifically valid. It is often not necessary. If you have a kid or an adult who is constantly sweating, even in cold temperatures, goes outside, skis in the wintertime, in the snow and in the cold, wearing shorts and a t-shirt, they seem to get wound up in the late afternoon or evening. Their face turns red, their ears turn bright red, the ears and cheeks are warm or hot to the touch, the torso feels like it's just emanating heat, they're sweating while they're sleeping. All of these are the telltale signs of temperature dysregulation. So we have another question here where someone is asking, what are, or if there are, medications that help treat this? There are. And in our book on FOH and on temperature dysregulation and sleep circadian rhythms, we have information on the medicinal interventions for this. The book managing temperature and sleep disruptions, that is more focused on lifestyle interventions that are low risk, high reward, that can be used at home without a prescription. The book on FOH goes into much more detail on the medicinal interventions. I would like to say that I am not a physician. I'm not an MD. I do not prescribe medications. The information that we share is based on consultation with MDs and based on the collected information and knowledge and experience of countless families who live with this disorder. So there are medications that help treat this. You can also go to our YouTube page and look at our seminar from earlier this year on what is FOH, and it will talk about those medicinal interventions. They're all very safe. They have all been around. They're all generic meds that have been around for ages and ages and ages and have been demonstrated to be safe and effective for use in children. However, some of them are what is considered off-label. So, for example, in bipolar disorder, it was found that the anti-seizure medications that were used to treat epilepsy, like Tegretol, Trileptal, Lamotrigine, that those anti-seizure medications also had mood stabilizing effects, but they were not initially approved by the FDA to treat mood. They were approved to treat seizures. So they were being prescribed what's called off-label for mood regulation. And over many, many years, as it was demonstrated to be effective at mood stabilizing, they were then ultimately FDA approved for use in mood stabilization. And now they're referred to as both anti-epileptics as well as mood stabilizers. The same is true with the medications that treat temperature dysregulation. Some of them are being used off-label at this time, but hopefully in years to come, as their efficacy continues to be proven over and over again, that the FDA will officially approve them for use in other disorders. But the truth is that they're common medications that can be prescribed by any physician who has prescribing privileges. And again, if you want more information on that, please see our book on FOH, and please see our seminar on FOH or our 3-part series with Dr. Papalos. Part 2 of that series with Dr. Papalos specifically talks about the medications, how they're used, and how they are introduced in what order. Y'all are really pressuring me to say what the names of the medications are, and so I'll share them, but I'm going to edit this out of the recording because, again, I'm not an MD. Oftentimes clonidine, which is a blood pressure medication, is used to treat the temperature dysregulation. It helps the body release built up heat because it's a vasodilator, which is how it works as a blood pressure medication, but it's very effective, especially, and is commonly given to children as a sleep aid. Melatonin, which is an over-the-counter medication, can also be used to treat temperature dysregulation because it also helps to release built-up body heat. That's how melatonin works. It prepares the body for sleep and makes us sleepy by cooling us down, because that's how the body recognizes it's time to start to go to sleep. And they also use intranasal or sublingual ketamine in its generic form for the temperature regulation control, and that is on the World Health Organization's list of the safest and most important medications to have on hand for children specifically, as well as adults. So they are all 3 well-known, safe, frequently prescribed medications that can be used to treat the temperature dysregulation. Are there additional questions? We are just about out of time today, so it seems as though we have perfect timing. For those professionals who are interested in more information, please don't hesitate to join our professional discussion groups during which we address issues related to bipolar disorder, fear of harm, mood disorders in children, helping professionals feel confident in their diagnoses of these especially complex cases that may come across your desk. For families, please also check out our resources on our website. We have a tremendous number of things that can help families and providers and educators manage these disorders and set kids up for success. I want to thank everyone for being here with us tonight and let you know that next month is August. Our webinar on the third Wednesday, the 21st, is called Back to School Essentials. We do a Back to School Essentials webinar every August. This year we are meeting with educational tester named Steve Hursting. He does educational testing for schools, and he's going to talk and for families, and he's going to talk with us about what that educational testing means, how to understand the results, how to use the results to advocate for your child at school, and what it's all about. Then the following week, we are going to have a clinical seminar on August 28th for our professional community. Families are welcome as well, but this is going to be a deep dive into differentiating bipolar disorder from borderline personality disorder, which is one of the disorders that bipolar is often confused with. We're going to have an expert in bipolar with us, an expert in borderline personality disorder with us, and we're going to talk about the similarities, the differences, and how you can tell them apart. We are also have our monthly book club. In the next couple of months, we're taking a deep dive into the book, The Out of Sync Child. You can get information about that through our website's book club page, found under the programs menu tab on our website's homepage. So again, thank you for being here. If you would like a certificate of completion, please go to your email tomorrow. You will get your Zoom email attendee follow-up email, and the details on how to request have been in there. Thank you again. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We are here to help. You can reach us at info or admin@cmhrc.org. Have a wonderful evening, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Good night.